So tonight we are recording this session. I hope that is okay with everyone, and we are looking forward to a wonderful discussion. Just before we dive into questions, a quick note on opportunity. As we approach the end of financial year, the need is greater than ever. Opportunity International Australia, in case you don't know us, we believe that women can and do change the world for good. Opportunity last year helped a massive 7.5 million families in Asia make the journey out of poverty. And we're part of an incredible global network. And thanks to our generous supporters, we're helping to end poverty one family and community at a time. By providing small loans to families in need, we help women grow their own businesses and generate sustainable incomes, creating a new future for generations to come. So let's dive in. Before we go into questions, just a bit more on Rabia. And I'm just wondering, Rafi, if you're spotlighting Rabia at the moment. Thank you. Rabia was decorated by the late Queen Elizabeth II for her humanitarian work in the Middle East, as well as in Asia, South America, and Europe, and became well known for having successfully sued the British Armed Forces and government for discrimination in a landmark case in 2008. Rabia is the author of the best-selling book Equal Justice: My Journey as a Woman and a Soldier and a Muslim. Apologies, I have a cough. Through her professional experience, her lived experience as a humanitarian worker and trauma survivor, Rabia brings unique perspectives to her work like no other. Welcome, Rabia.
Thank you, Nicole.
Yes.
Lovely to be with you. And I feel your pain. Nothing worse than having a cough when you're trying to present.
No, I'm sorry. I was going okay until a minute ago. Rabia, how did you first become involved with opportunity, and why does supporting women's empowerment and financial inclusion appeal to you?
So I probably first became involved with Opportunity about 10 years ago. A very dear friend of mine who'd been a member of Opportunity International for a number of years. Some of the people listening and watching may know her, Franca Salatena. She took me along to an Opportunity International event, and it didn't take long for me when I was attending this event to be completely inspired by the work and by the impact that opportunity had on particularly women and their children in communities around the world. And I was speaking to her more about it and asking questions of her and the other members that were at the event. And at that stage, I realized that it was something that very much spoke to my heart and very strongly to my values. I wanted to help, so I became a member. And then as time passed, I was approached and invited to be an ambassador. So I've been back in Australia probably about 12 or 13 years. And so 10 or so of those years, I've been a member and a very proud ambassador. In terms of, as I said, what really spoke to me is the focus on Opportunity International's work on giving a hand up as opposed to a handout, and helping to lift up and equip women and children with economic independence and empowerment. And as we know, as the saying goes, you know, you lift up a woman, you lift up a whole community. And in my lifetime of work that I've been privileged to be a part of as a humanitarian, what I have seen over and over again in different parts of the world is that really it is the women that are the backbone of communities. And if we can help them with economic empowerment, with starting businesses, with being self-sufficient, with being able to feed and educate and clothe their children and themselves, that's the beginning of really rebuilding and holding up a whole community. And of course, we know that that has a ripple effect, and I've seen that with my own eyes. So that was really what inspired me, and what continues to inspire me and engage me as an ambassador for opportunity.
Thanks, Rabia. I just wanted to also mention that you're really driven to serve, empower, and inspire leaders to earn and build trust by fostering greater resilience, integrity, inclusion, and belonging. This is the key to enhancing leadership and organizational credibility and ensuring sustainable success. I love that about your background and your experience. Just before we go into more questions with Rabia, I just wanted to give a warning that some of the content we may discuss during her address, I should be speaking about sexual abuse, mental illness, and acts of war. So if any of these are likely to cause you distress, please feel comfortable to leave at any point. If you decide to stay and listen, you can also reach out to a mental health professional if you have need any support, or speak to someone you trust. So, Rabia, you've spent time working as a human rights lawyer. How is poverty a
Mm.
human rights issue, particularly when it comes to women and girls?
Gosh, I think everyone tuning in now will see, when they look at the news and on their TV screens and they see what's going on in the world, it is so obvious the answer to that question. I guess in the 3 decades that I've been involved as a human rights lawyer and doing humanitarian work, it is very clear to me, as well as the fact that there is plethora of scientific and evidence-based data to tell us that women and children are the ones most affected by conflict and most affected by poverty. And of course, most affected by violence as well. So when you have displaced societies and communities, where you have societies and communities where water and food security are not assured, where there is conflict, where there is violence, societies where the laws and the cultures impinge upon human rights, it is always, without exception, women and children who are disproportionately impacted by all of those things, which is what makes Opportunity International and agencies like that so integral. It is the very nature of conflict and war and poverty and human rights abuses that flow from all of those wicked problems in the world that impact women and children the most. Men are often forced to leave the family, leave the villages, leave the communities and fight, or go off to work to try and support their families, or are often killed or seriously injured, leaving the women to have to not only keep and run the house and the communities, but to feed their families. So, there are all sorts of circumstances that come from poverty and conflict and war that mean that women are the ones that bear the responsibility, the burden, and them and their children are the ones that suffer the greatest as well. So that is I guess, not only a common theme and reality, but something that I have seen and experienced firsthand. And the flip side of that, of course, is that it is the women and the children, but predominantly women, wives, aunties, mothers, grandmothers, that are the ones that show the best of humanity and the strength and the resilience and the most incredible survival instincts in amidst the worst of humanity and the worst of suffering.
You have achieved so much in your life already, Rabia. Tell us about some of the key moments that have really shaped your life, and led you really to become a global change maker. You have an enormous passion, and we'd love to know more about it.
Well, I guess it would be remiss of me to not mention at the very top of that. You're right, I have been very privileged and blessed. I've led a very rich life, and I've been able to spend my life doing very meaningful work, for which I'm very grateful. I guess the most life shaping, life changing event for me was becoming a mother. And my friends joke and tell me that I do nothing by halves, and this was no exception. I'm the mother of triplets. So my boys are now 16 going on 17, triplet boys. And I think becoming a mother of 3 all at once and parenting on steroids has changed me forever in terms of the way I look at the world. My children are my inspiration. They're the biggest source of strength and drive to carry on and to do what I can to serve others and to make whatever positive impact in the world that I can, because I am deeply, deeply concerned about the world that they are inheriting and what state we are going to leave the world when we move on. So I need to be the best role model I can. I need to instill in them the values of kindness and generosity and inclusion and love for everybody, and a commitment to live a life bigger and beyond themselves. So I would probably, answer your question by saying, first and foremost, that is probably the most profound, life-changing experience that I've been through. I think also being a child of the 70s and coming to Australia in the mid 1970s as a migrant's child and experiencing very much through my father, an Indian Muslim immigrant, the discrimination and the prejudice that was very much alive back in those days. That sowed a very important seed for me, which later became my commitment and passion to equality and social justice. And I guess also being a victim survivor of sexual abuse as a child, and also family and domestic violence as a child, and then later as an adult, really informed and influenced a lot of the decisions and choices I made in life and I took in life. Not least deciding to use the law as a vehicle to then become a human rights lawyer and to use what had happened to me as, I guess, a positive vehicle for change in my life and hopefully in the lives of those that I have helped along the way to access justice and to share their stories. So I think if I was to look back on my life, they are probably the main life-changing, life-shaping events that have shaped me and my values and what I do and how I walk through the world.
Well, that is just incredible. I actually didn't know you were the mother to triplets, so that is incredible. I was already impressed. So that's just adding to the CV right there. Rabia, you've witnessed and experienced a lot of adversity in your life. You touched on it just a minute ago. How does one overcome seemingly impossible situations and experiences to then really flip it and then create
Mm.
an opportunity for change?
Yeah. Well, I guess what we're really talking about there, Nicole, is resilience. So how does one overcome tough times, suffering, adversity, loss, and turn that into a driver for change? You know, not only, as they say, survive but thrive. And I think resilience is the key. You know, the big question that everyone asks is, are we born resilient, or do we make ourselves resilient? Can we build resilience? And I think my honest answer to that, having worked in this space for a long time, is both. I think some people are fortunate enough to be born equipped with deep inner strength and grit, but we can build it as well. And I think personally for me, holding those people and those things that held me in my times of deepest, darkest distress and disillusionment, the people and the things that comforted me, that gave me purpose, that gave me a reason to keep breathing and to take another step and to live to see another day, when there has been more than one occasion in my life where I didn't know if I wanted to or even could carry on. So I would say to people, think of the darkest times in your life when you've been on your knees, and you're all here with us now. So think then of the people that were there to hold you when you needed holding the most, and the things that gave you purpose and gave you meaning and gave you just that little bit of strength to carry on for a while longer. And they're the things that we need to hold dear and continue to hold close and dear, to give us that reason, to give us that motivation, and to give us that inspiration, not only to survive, but to then make our lives more meaningful, more purposeful, so that we can overcome and then go on to greater things and greater good and positive actions. I think also for me, values, being really, really clear about identifying the values which form your core and committing to living a life in alignment with those values. I think whenever I have been thrown a curveball in life or veered off the path, as we all do because we're fallible human beings, coming back to my values and reminding myself what drives me, what I hold dear, and recommitting to living in alignment with what is important to me as a human being has set me back on track and has put me back on my true north. So resilience and the people and the things that help build that resilience and that purpose and motivation, and clear values and a commitment to living in alignment with them. They would be my answers.
Yeah, wonderful. I love the values alignment. It really helps set the roadmap, doesn't it? When you sort of, especially when you're dealing with difficult situations. Rabia, just wanted to pass over to you now for some practical tips and inspiration. Just to really hear a bit more of your story and to hear about, what it's one of the things you talk about are gifts in a crisis. And I just wondered if you might touch on some of that for our participants tonight.
Sure. Well, I'll try and keep this as informal as possible. This is not going to be a formal presentation, but what I hope I can do is to share a little bit of my journey in the hope that it will resonate with those watching and listening, in the hope that it might provide some meaning, some inspiration for all of those listening as they go from our time together. And some of this I've touched on already. And of course, we start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the beautiful lands on which we all meet. And when we speak about our Indigenous brothers and sisters, they've been sharing stories for millennia as a way of bringing people together and uniting and engaging and inspiring our hearts and our minds. And what I have come to learn is that there is no more powerful vehicle than the vehicle of human story to impact positive change. And that's something that Opportunity International are very committed in. And that is taking the time to listen, to really hear the stories of the women and the children and the communities that need help, that need inspiring, that need some empowerment. And it's through those stories that the rest of us are touched and our hearts are engaged and our heads are ignited to do better and to help others. So, I guess in terms of my journey, I've touched upon it already. I am the eldest of two children, child of an Indian Muslim migrant. We came to Australia in the mid-70s when White Australia policy was very much alive. And what that meant in those early years was experiencing firsthand a lot of prejudice and discrimination. And later on, when I was 9 and my baby brother had not long arrived, I was the victim of child sexual abuse by a man who was my adopted grandfather, whom I trusted and loved and who exploited my innocence. And back in those days, when eventually I had the strength and the courage to tell my parents what had been happening for what seemed like an eternity in order to protect my little brother from the same fate, my parents did the best that they could. But, like the rest of us, they were the product of their time and their culture and their experiences and their beliefs. And they were very, very conscious and afraid that that abuse would bring tremendous shame and stigma on our family. And so the decision was made to sweep the abuse under the carpet and to never speak of it again. The police were never called, and my abuser, whom I called Pop back then, was never brought to justice. And I guess the impact of that decision at the very tender age of 9.5 left me feeling incredibly powerless and voiceless. And that impact would be what would ultimately shape and drive me for the rest of my life and inform a lot of the major decisions I would take in life. I was heading down a trajectory, probably until young adulthood, where being very conscious that I was different as an immigrant, that I now had this secret that was starting to eat me alive, it almost destroyed me. And it wasn't until my parents gave me the next gift, because of course the first profound gift was coming to this country. And so, like everybody else, I won the lottery of life in being able to be raised and living in this incredible country, Australia, where we have so many freedoms and so many luxuries that we can take for granted. But the second gift they gave me when I really needed it the most was a gift of a new environment. It was actually a school. But thanks to the leaders and everyone that made up this environment, they created a place that was truly inclusive. And it's the first place where I felt like I belonged. It was the first place when I needed it the most in my late teens that I started believing that perhaps I was worthy of better treatment than I had received. And maybe, just maybe, I could have some dreams for my life. And it was at that point, thanks to this place and the people that created it, that I was able to make a pivotal decision. And that was that I was no longer going to be defined by the abuse and the suffering that had plagued me. And somehow I was going to turn this into a positive legacy for change. And all I knew at that stage is that I wanted to use the vehicle of the law. So later on, I went on to university, qualified as a lawyer, worked for a number of years here in Australia with some incredible communities that taught me, I guess, so much about humility and humanity. Regional, remote and Indigenous communities, asylum seekers and refugees, victims of family, domestic and sexual violence. And all the while, there was this voice inside my head that was getting louder and louder. And eventually I realized that was the voice of my calling me to even higher duties. So I listened to that voice, and at the end of 1990s, I left Australia and I was heading to the UK. And eventually my decision was that I needed to listen to this calling, which was to serve as a humanitarian lawyer, to tell the stories of, to advocate for, to represent people that had suffered the most abhorrent human rights abuses, but particularly people that lived in parts of the world where justice and equality were foreign concepts. And the vehicle through which I decided to use to realise this calling was the British military. So I decided that I was going to join the British Army as a legal officer. And at the time, the British Army was actively recruiting Commonwealth citizens, particularly professional officers. So I knew that as a legal officer in the British Army, I would be able to access the people that desperately needed humanitarian help in ways that other people were not able to access them because of, some of the places where they lived. And a lot of these places were countries that were going through war and conflict. So they say timing is everything. Everyone would have heard that expression, I'm sure. And that turned out to be a very relevant saying for me, because the very week that I graduated and completed my military officer training and became a captain and a legal officer in the British Army turned out to be the week of 9/11, which I'm sure most people listening and watching us this evening will remember where they were and what they were doing when they heard of the terror attacks on that day. So for me, everything changed in that moment. And of course, the world changed in ways that we're still experiencing. What that meant is that I spent a number of years as a legal officer serving in the Middle East. And I spent the year of 2005 in Iraq. And some of the people that are joining us this evening may or may not know part of my story that occurred in Iraq that became quite public. I was more than halfway through my tour of Iraq. It was September of 2005. Two of my colleagues, two British Special Forces soldiers, were kidnapped and beaten and detained by Iranian-backed terrorists who were responsible for a lot of the explosive attacks that were going off in Iraq at the time that were killing thousands of innocent Iraqis and hundreds of military personnel. And a colleague of mine who was specially trained for this kind of scenario was sent in by our commander with a group of his men to do what was necessary to peacefully secure the release of our two colleagues. And he wasn't having much luck. And he was dealing with a representative that had been sent in by the Iraqi government, a judge as it so happened. And in desperation, he asked the judge, what would it take and who would it take for him to agree to negotiate the release of our two guys? And essentially, the judge said to my colleague, James, you send in the only one of you that has shown us any respect, that has taken the time to sit with us and listen to our concerns and our fears, our aspirations and our hopes for our community, and asked us how they could help and serve us, not like the rest of you who have stood over us and pointed the finger at us and told us what we needed to do and how to get it done. And James said to him, sir, absolutely. You tell me who that is and I'll get them for you. So the judge said to James, you send in Major Rabia, which was me. So off the strength of that, our commander sent me in to take over from James and to lead what we now understood to be hostage negotiations. And I was petrified, of course, because I'm not a trained hostage negotiator. This wasn't my area of expertise. But my father used to tell my brother Adam and I that there will be times in your life where you'll be called upon to step outside of your comfort zone and to do something uncomfortable for the greater good. And the decisions that you make in those moments will define your character. My dad used to speak a lot about character. And those words came into my head at that very moment when I needed them the most. And finally, I understood what Dad meant. And he was talking about a moment like this. So really, I had no choice because the lives of my two colleagues now rested on my shoulders. So I went in and I took over from James and I led the negotiations with the judge. But unfortunately, things went very wrong several hours later. And James and I also became hostages, along with four other colleagues, four Special Forces colleagues. And in a cell with all my male colleagues, as the only female, as the only one with Muslim heritage, as the only Arabic speaker, all of which had served me well up until that point in Iraq, but now at the hands of our terrorist captors in the cell where we were now being held, I was considered the prime target and the biggest traitor of them all. And so for the next 8.5 hours in front of my male colleagues in the cell where we were now being held, I was degraded and humiliated and tortured. But thankfully, at the 8.5 hour point, we were rescued. And that should have been the end of the most traumatic experience of my life. But unfortunately, it wasn't. And it heralded what became later my biggest battle. And that related to the way that we were treated by the military and the British government afterwards. We all survived, miraculously. We were flown back to our headquarters, where all the headquarters staff had gathered to greet us. All of the men that were held with me that day, so 7 men, and I was the 8th, they all received a hero's welcome, recognition, acknowledgement, and later James was even decorated by the Queen, the late Queen, for his bravery. They all received trauma counselling, which was standard procedure, of course, if you'd been through what we had been through. Unfortunately, I did not receive the same welcome. I received no acknowledgement or recognition for the role that I had been ordered to perform that day, nor did I receive any acknowledgement or recognition for what I had endured for 8.5 hours. And my commander knew because he'd been briefed. And I never received any trauma counselling either. And I was so confused. I could not understand why I was being treated so differently. But I had to put those feelings of confusion and anger and betrayal to one side because I still had a number of months to serve in Iraq, and I was there to serve people that were suffering the most hideous abuses. So I sucked it up and I soldiered on until the end of 2005 when I eventually returned to the UK. What I didn't realise is that I'd returned a broken shell of my former self. And I didn't realise how broken until the following year of 2006, when eventually, after a number of other traumatic events, losing a pregnancy in very extreme circumstances, my then husband being diagnosed with cancer, and receiving a very poor prognosis, and then getting a call from a colleague who was still in Iraq to tell me that my closest Iraqi friend and colleague, who had stood with me and stood alongside me in exposing the abuses of his people, that he had been executed, leaving behind his amazing wife and 2 gorgeous children under 4. When I received that call after the trauma and the loss and the suffering that I was already experiencing together with my husband, I fell to my knees. I believed that I was responsible for my friend Asaf's death, that I would be the reason for why his 2 precious children would now grow up without their daddy. And on that day, my whole world went black, and I didn't want to live another second. Because all around me, all I saw was darkness and chaos and misery and injustice. And all I felt was pain, sheer, overwhelming, debilitating pain. And when I spoke earlier about the fact that we've all been on our knees and we've all needed people to hold us and things to remind us why life is worth continuing to live, It was a moment like that I was talking about. And despite what my husband was going through, he was the one that held me and reminded me that there was a reason to live and to keep going. And he said the words to me when he picked me up from the floor that day, "My darling, you're broken and you need help." And that was a gift, hearing those words from him, because I finally realized I needed to seek medical help. And I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. And that was a gift, because now my demon had a name and I could start the work of confronting my demon in order to overcome and heal. And I needed to heal because I had a fight on my hands, because the very day that I found out that James was awarded a military cross for his bravery by the late Queen was the same day I received a written order by the most senior commander of the armed forces, ordering me never to speak of the role that I had performed in Iraq. It was called a gag order, or order, as we called it then. And I knew that that was wrong. And on that day, when I received the order, having just read James's Military Cross bravery citation, I had a flashback to 9-year-old Rabia, and I realized that I was being gagged again in my life. And I knew that I couldn't let it happen this time, because not only was I 20 years older, I dedicated my life to the law, to justice, to equality, for goodness sake. And I was also a leader. And I believed that I needed to lead by example and in accordance with my values. I was a role model and I was privileged. You know, I had a sphere of influence, I had a voice. And if this was happening to me, if I was being silenced and being written out of history and being marginalized, goodness knows what was happening to others that were less privileged than me. So, having had the gift of now being healed, it was time to right that wrong. And I exhausted every avenue of justice that was available to me until the only path left was an extreme one. And I had to take it because I was now committed. And it wasn't just about me now, it was about speaking truth to power for all those that didn't have a voice. And that path meant that I had to mount a discrimination case against the British Armed Forces and sue the British government. So that's what I did. And it took 18 months to get to court. And I went to hell and back in that time. But eventually I got my day in court. And I guess, what do you know, I won my case. But the win wasn't in the win so much. The win was in the lessons from the journey. And what happened was, within months of my case being heard, thousands of discrimination cases came through the floodgates and filled the courts. Within 6 months of my case being heard, the first woman was awarded a military cross, and that fundamentally changed the whole debate and dialogue about the role of women on the front line and as first responders. And within a year of my case being heard, there was an investigation into the Army, the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, and that led to fundamental, profound changes in legislation, policy, culture, importantly, and the attitudes around the way women, ethnic minorities, LGBTIQ plus personnel, and personnel with mental health injuries and moral injuries were being treated. And that was replicated 5 years later in the British public sector. So I guess what I want to share in closing with everyone is that the biggest win for me was in the biggest gift of awareness and the life lesson that I took from that journey, which is simply the power of the one. The power that we all have to create ripples of change if we choose to embrace our capacity to do so. And I guess Mother Teresa said it best when she said, "I alone cannot change the world, but I can cast a stone across the water and create many ripples." And it's this ripple effect of positive impact that we all have the capacity to create. And that, particularly when we see the crisis today, that millions and millions of people, particularly women and children, are in the middle of suffering from, we need to remember that we have gifts, that we are privileged, and that we can give the gift of positive change through simple ways that we can act. donating to Opportunity International, starting in our communities at home and around us, and then further on beyond borders. So, the power of the one and our ability to create ripples of change. And we know that when ripples come together, they create waves of positive change that fundamentally change people's lives and the future trajectory of communities. That's, I guess, what I wanted to share in terms of this theme of looking out for and embracing our gifts in amidst crises in the world and crises in our lives, always looking for the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to live a better and bigger life beyond ourselves, and choosing to live in alignment with our values and choosing to do what we can to create positive impact in our communities and in the world around us. So I hope that's been of use. I hope that has resonated with people and provided some small amount of wisdom or inspiration. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Nicole.
Rabia, that is the most extraordinary story, and thank you so much for sharing that so courageously. And I doubt that there's a person on tonight that has not got something out of that or been inspired at some deep level. Yeah, you epitomize the idea of a global change maker. So thank you for sharing that. Just extraordinary. So now we'll hand over to and introduce Suzzanne. Suzzanne is our second speaker tonight. She is an internationally accredited, award-winning business coach, as we said, and renowned keynote speaker. Her wealth of personal experience, combined with a deep passion for coaching, has made her one of Australia's most respected business coaches. As a wife, mum, and nan, she values family and health, committing to personal and professional growth. We'll have to ask her about some of her extraordinary clocking up the kilometres as part of our questions, which is inspiring. Suzzanne is also an ambassador and passionate supporter of Opportunity International Australia for over 10 years. So welcome, Suzzanne. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And it was amazing listening to Rabia's story. So yeah, thank you.
What a deep privilege, huh, to be on tonight. So, Suzzanne, tell us about some extraordinary moments that have changed your life and made you the person that you are today.
And I think of what Rabia was saying in relation to those moments. And sometimes there is one big event, but sometimes it's multiple events. It's the compounding effect. And I had a reasonably tough childhood at home, and my mum would always play what we called the Pollyanna game. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, which is just looking at the positive side of whatever situation that we were in. And it was just something we'd always play. I remember playing it from being the tiniest child. It was like, okay, well, let's look at all the good. Let's look at all the great things in the situation or the person. So I was brought up with that kind of attitude and that kind of game. And then, as I became an adult, I suppose that the biggest life-changing moment was when I had to save my husband's life. And that was, we had a house fire. And that was, I was in my early 20s, and seeing my house on fire and my husband on fire was one of, the most horrific things that I would, have ever experienced. And so it was that moment that Rabia was talking about, where you have to jump out of your total comfort zone and do something. And I've got the house on fire and a husband on fire. And I had to, quickly try and put out the fire and drag someone whose whole body is literally on fire and melting out of the burning house, and work out what I was going to do. And luckily that quick thinking that I moved into got him in the swimming pool and saved his life. And that change, that was the worst thing I think that has ever happened in our life, because he actually passed away on day 3. He was in a coma, and he had over 30% of his body was 3rd-degree burns. So it was absolutely horrific. You couldn't recognize him as a human being, but he came back, and it changed him and the way he was. He knew there was a reason why he had to come back in this world, and it changed his attitude about life and about purpose. And so from then on, it was a totally different way of looking at life. There was nothing could ever be that bad again. There was no nitpicking of little things anymore. Our relationship had gone on a totally different level when you've had to feed somebody and bathe them and help them toilet and basic human functions when you're in your early 20s. It just creates a different, I suppose, awareness and humanness and intimacy on a totally different level that a lot of people would never experience. So then, that was definitely the most pivotal life-changing event that has ever happened, because it changed the trajectory of both of our lives. And then 10 years later, after supporting my husband through, he went in a 10-year hole of, every kind of self-medication possible and deep depression, of being a good-looking young guy in his, in his early 30s to Freddy Krueger overnight. I then was, diagnosed with a life-threatening disease, and I was given 5 years to live. So the tables were then turned. So then he had to support me, and we had to go through the same but in reverse. So it was a real a challenge of what's important, and a real challenge on our relationship and what's important in life. And we actually got to a point where we said, if I've only got to a stage where we were counting the 5 years and there was only 3 years left, and we were like, okay, well, let's just forget life here and go and backpack the world with the kids. And we did that when they were 5 and 9, and we free camped pretty much all the way around the world. We didn't have any money. We did it on woofing and camping, and getting things from Good Sands and doing a bit of work when we could around. So it was just about quality time with the people that we love and what's most important in life. Because if we all were told that our loved one was not going to be here in a short amount of time, do we really need the new car, or do we need, that fancy, hairdo, or it's not important anymore.
I can totally relate to that. I love that you, again, like Rabia, turned something that was really traumatic and challenging into a force for good and change. Suzzanne, tell us about your why. Why are you so passionate about supporting women living in poverty through opportunities work? And share a bit about your experience of meeting our wonderful founder, David Basso, if you will.
Yeah, that was amazing and incredible. From a very young age, because I suppose my mum, always played the Pollyanna game, I always thought and I remember thinking as a very young child, that it is our obligation to make a difference on this world, because we are so, so blessed to be born here, that we have so many privileges, and that I always just thought, well, it is our obligation that we must do and help and make an impact on the rest of the people in the world that weren't. And I remember thinking that as like 5, 6-year-old, that we have to, because it's our obligation, because we've been given this gift of this wonderful, as Ravi said, lottery of life. We've been given this lottery ticket to squandering it on material rubbish that as soon as it's bought, we want another one. Like, that is just laughing in the face of an amazing opportunity. And so when I read David Busso's book many years ago, when it first came out, I was just moved, transfixed, inspired. I was like, I have to get involved with this organization, because I'm not a rich person. I can't go and donate lots of money yet, but I love this concept. I'd never heard of microfinancing. And so I was like, I have to get involved with this organization. It is amazing. And then the universe transpired within 6 months. The Aunt Clark, who was in Perth at the moment, at that time, met my husband, and my husband's like, you've got to meet my wife. She talks about your organisation. She read David Brousseau's book, and I'd always dream. If someone said who is the most inspirational person in the world, I would say David Brousseau. And I got to meet him, only a month ago, and was overwhelmed with emotion at being in the presence of somebody that had made such huge ripples in the world to the, over 7 million, and probably more than that, because that's clients. Like, look at each family has probably 4 or 5 children. We're talking about, 35, 40 million people, and the loans get reloaned back, that he's actually changed their lives for the better. He's programmed their poverty, direction, and got people first ever, path that they could actually see. So that was, a huge honor to actually meet, it's like saying, you met Gandhi or Mother Teresa or someone like that. That's what it was like for me. And I was overcome with emotion and overwhelm, and sheer joy.
Well, I can attest to that star quality about David, because I just had the privilege of traveling with him to Indonesia, and we're going to do some storytelling and tell more about that. But he is just such an incredible, humble man, and the power, as you say, of what he's done. I think just from creating opportunities and seeing opportunities where people would say, "Oh, that's nothing," but it's the way he thinks as an entrepreneur that is really mind-blowing, I think. And he sees solutions where other people see problems. But Suzzanne, thank you so much for sharing that. How did you find a way to utilize your skills and influence to drive change and create impact?
I think because I was a small business person and was not a philanthropist and a millionaire, I would just think of ways that I could make a difference myself. Just small ways. As a child, we used to sponsor someone in another country, and then as my kids grew up, they would do things to help people less fortunate. And so I thought, well, what skills do I have? So if I'm doing events, I would put on and say, the tickets. I'm a business coach and help people with, strategic planning. So I would often do lunch and learns and things like this, and say, okay, well, it's $30 a ticket. And at that time, when I first was an ambassador over 10 years ago, $30 was an average micro loan that would make a difference. And that was just huge joy saying, and then I would show people that's the money that's gone, and that's changed 5 women's lives. And my husband's a yoga teacher now, and before probably when he first started, maybe for 3 or 4 years, every month he would put on a yoga class and say donations only. So it's just looking at what small things can we implement into our already busy lives that can pay it forward. At the moment, and this is something that, anyone can take this idea on. If you have a skill or if you have a gift and people come to you and say, you've helped someone, because often people, they help people, and someone says, I'd love to thank you so much. And what I do is I say, look, I would love to accept your gratitude. And gratitude for me is if you donate to Opportunity International. And I found this because I had someone gave me this gift voucher of all this rubbish, a gift basket of all this rubbish. And I said, thank you, thank you, thank you. I really appreciate it. But next time you want to thank me, please donate to Opportunity International instead. So it's just a way of, paying it forward that's going to have a massive impact, because you don't want that, basket of, and people like to say thank you.
I love that. And I love if people don't know enough about David Brousseau, he talks about the economics of enough, and it's really worth reading up about, because we certainly don't need more gift baskets and material
No.
things really in 2025. Suzzanne, I really have been dying to get to this question. You recently cycled over 700 kilometers from Albury to Perth for charity. What drives you to push through barriers, physical barriers, when other people say it's really not possible?
And my husband asked the same question. He was like, why on earth would you do that? To do something that's challenging, and to make a difference, do something that makes a difference. Because every year I have a local charity to support, but my lifelong charity, my international charity, is Opportunity International. So that was for youth suicide. And yeah, I thought, why not? It was something that was out of my realm of possibility. And it was, yeah, definitely the hardest challenge I've ever done physically as a sporting challenge, and as an endurance athlete, I've done a lot. So yeah, that's why.
Thank you, Suzzanne. And we're running out of time, but
I know we
there are
are.
a couple of tips from you that you wanted to leave people with tonight. Things that have helped you, just anything that you want to share tonight.
Yeah, I'll be very quick because I'm excited for everyone to watch Vali's video, which I'll hand over to you in 2 secs. In line with business planning, number one for me is be clear of what your successful vision is. It's in line with Rabia, with values. You know, what is success? What's in your heart? What makes you sing? Be very clear of what that vision is. It's important to see what success is, because if we don't know what it is, we can't go and do it. The second one is have a positive attitude with whatever you do, because you will always get a better result with a positive attitude. No matter what is happening to you in life, it's just happening. If you have a positive attitude with what's happening, you'll come out better. The third one is every single day, do whatever you can do to help another human being, because your heart will feel so much richer, so much happier, and you'll be a much, much more purposeful human being if you are looking for ways to help the other, you know, human beings that come across your life. It will make you on so much more purposeful path. And they're my 3 tips. So I will pass to you to watch the video.
Oh, thank you so much, Suzzanne. And we might just dive straight into Vali's video. She's our end of financial year story and an inspiring woman. So over to you, Rafi.
Vali lives in rural India, where few women have a job, income or economic opportunities. Often isolated in their homes, most lack agency over their financial well-being. As a young mum, Vali and her children were plunged further into crisis when her husband died suddenly from an illness they couldn't afford to treat. Alone in the world with no relatives, Vali summoned her courage and resorted to labour work, collecting potatoes to survive in her rural village. Most nights they went to bed hungry. Right now, millions of women globally, like Vali, are experiencing poverty, locked in an economic system with few options, no matter how hard they work. You can help flip the system and create massive change, empowering women entrepreneurs with small loans and businesses. Vali is proof that it works. Through the power of small loans and small businesses from Opportunity International, Australia's partner in India, Vali now owns 5 cows, 3 calves and a sewing machine.
સાંજે 5 લિટર દૂધ ભરું, સવારે 5 ભરું. એવી રીતે મારા દાડા કાઢું અને હંસોનું કપડાના પૈસો આવે એથી ને મારું જીવન ગુજારું.
Her grandchildren go to the local school. Daughter-in-law also has a small sewing business thanks to a small loan. And Vali has a small business selling milk to the local dairy co-op. But our work is not done and more help is urgently needed. Donate today. Go to opportunity.org.au.
If you've been moved by Vali's story and also the stories tonight, we have some amazing advocates, and we would consider it a great pleasure and privilege if you consider donating to us. Submit your tax return and then you'll receive hopefully a substantial amount back from the taxman. And that's what it takes to make a difference. And no obligation, but we would love it if you want to be on the journey with us and be a system flipper. Thank you so much for your time and generosity tonight and in joining us today. And also thank you again to Rabia and Suzzanne. You've inspired all of us. I know that so much. So thank you. I'm Nicole Clements, and bye for now. We'll see you next time.